Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfood, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En Route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom.
Hey, welcome back to the Pat Flynn Show. I have for you what I believe is an enormously interesting interview today. My guest is Professor Rachel Fulton Brown of the University of Chicago, and she is an expert on so many different things, and she's a person that I could talk to for hours on end on a myriad of different subjects, and indeed we do explore a myriad of different subjects on this episode. She is an expert on medieval biblical exegesis. She is herself a medievalist, historian, a specialist on Marian devotions and the art of prayer, and just an overall incredibly interesting and intelligent and gentle woman. I love her writing. I love her professional work, and I loved chatting with her, and I think you're going to get a ton out of this conversation. We start on the subject of spiritual discipline, what that looks like, how to develop it, and we go off from there. The other thing to note, about more or less mobbed this poor woman. And so, you know me, I like talking to people who are still willing and able to freely exchange ideas, even if I don't agree with all of them. This is so important. I've made the argument many times how important the free exchange of ideas is for society and humanity in general. If we want to go from a state of understanding less to understanding more, which pretty much everybody agrees with, to be a human is to want to know things. That's kind of a basic truth of who we are. We desire to know everything about everything. But in order to do that, we need to be able to argue things out. We need to be able to exchange ideas if we're going to make any advancements in understanding. But there's certain cliques within academia and elsewhere that they just really can't stand this idea. So they attempt to stamp out, usually through very petulant and childish means, anybody who says things that they disagree with. And I find this abhorrent, and I've shared my experiences on this many times, and I like to talk to people who are, again, fighting against this, because I think it's so important. So I think you'll be very interested to hear about her story and a lot of the things that she's gone on to do afterwards because of that. So there's kind of two sides to this interview. There's the very rich, deep personal history of herself, her spiritual and religious practice, her making her way through Christianity, eventually into Catholicism, her takes on spiritual discipline, how she ties those into fencing and fitness generally, her takes on virtues, her work in medieval studies and history, all of that super interesting. And then there's the sort of more recent and edgy side of the stuff she's doing in academia, the causes that she's championing, and we get into all that studies and history, all of that super interesting. And then there's the sort of more recent and edgy side of the stuff she's doing in academia, the causes that she's championing. And we get into all that too, and I think there's just so much in here that I think you're going to find, no matter what angle you're coming from, no matter what background you're coming from, religious, political, or otherwise, I think you're going to get a lot out of this. I certainly did. Again, wonderful woman to talk to. I hope to have her on again, and I'm just going to be quiet now because intros are sort of boring. I know you all just want to actually hear the interview. So we will cue the cool Tom Cruise sounding voice actor opening, and then you will be hearing my interview with Professor Rachel Fulton Brown. Enjoy.
Ready to become better than most people at most things? Welcome to the Pat Flynn Show. Best-selling author, entrepreneur, fitness expert, and philosopher Pat Flynn teaches you how to learn and become amazing at almost everything through the concept of generalism, acquiring and stacking skills that will help you dominate in business and life. Want to get in shape? Write a book? Be a better precog division officer? Or simply launch a successful business empire? Well, sit back, relax, and listen as Pat and his guests offer digestible and entertaining insights on how to learn the skills, tactics, and strategies you need to pursue your goals and achieve the life you've always wanted.
Folks, I have a guest today that I Well, I admitted to her that I just want to talk to her about just a million different things. And I mean that. I'm really having difficulty to figure out where I want to start. By the way, this is Pat Flynn, your host of the show. And joining me today is Professor Rachel Fulton Brown, who is just a generalist, if there ever was one. Somebody who is interesting in a million different ways, is learned and experienced in a million different ways, teaches at University of Chicago, has research and training specialties in medieval Europe, history of Christianity, liturgy and prayer, devotions to the Virgin Mary. Also a figure of, I guess we could say, controversy in some ways as well, which I'm sure we're going to get into at some point or other. Professor Brown, thank you for taking the time to join me today.
Oh, thank you for having me.
So I want to start with what we said we were going to start with, which is the idea of fencing and spiritual discipline. But I think before we can get into that, and I know this is the first time talking, and I've spent a lot of time with your stuff these past couple of weeks, and really getting a ton out of it. But I am interested in hearing a bit, and I'm sure people will be as well, about your personal history, how you got to be doing what you're doing now with the blog and everything in academia, and your specialties and in Marian devotions and all that. Just take us through as much as you want.
I need a diagram, I think, right? That's No, I'm right now, in fact, teaching a course on virtues and vices in medieval Christian thought. And one of the things that we've learned is that for talking about the sort of complexity of the soul, it's very useful to have a picture, right? We've got these various tree diagrams of virtues and vices and wheels of. In my class last week, we were trying to diagram a very complicated Parisian text from the early 13th century, and they came up with 3 completely different diagrams. So which diagram shall I start you with? I think I can start best with a diagram that, in fact, inspired me to become a fencer. It's in a manuscript that's at the Getty now in Los Angeles, and it's a book of fencing by a Italian fencing master called Fiore de Liberi, and it's called The Flower of Battle. And if your listeners look it up, I mean, I got to go to the Getty once. I was there to give a talk at UCLA, and the students took me to the gallery, and we had a little tour around the manuscript exhibit, and they were mainly prayer books and so forth, and I'm really interested in that. And then the curator who was taking us around said, and then there's this book that everybody always talks to us about, that they prayer books and so forth, and I'm really interested in that. And then the curator who was taking us around said, and then there's this book that everybody always talks to us about, that they call us to talk to us about at the Getty, and it's this fencing manuscript. And I'm like, that's the one I wanted to see. She was very surprised. That it's mainly diagrams of different fight techniques. So it's, there's sword techniques, there's wrestling, there's, on horseback, on foot, and so forth. But the diagram that got me interested was a diagram of the master. And he's shown sort of standing with his arms crossed, and he has, it looks like a sort of starburst of swords coming out of his middle, right? And what it is it's showing the different lines of different guards, right, that you'd use in fencing. And he's surrounded by 4 animals. At his head, there's a lynx. On either side, on his hands are a lion and a tiger. Congress at Kalamazoo. This is 15 years ago, right? Indeed, the summer I started fencing. I just heard this talk at the conference, and the paper was on how this diagram of the fencing master was modeled on these monastic diagrams of virtues and vices and the sort of composition of the soul. And what the speaker, Rob Charon, he does a lot of work on this manuscript and on medieval fight manuals, was showing us was that these, this conceptualization of holding these virtues in your understanding in order to be able to make the moves that you need to was critical to training as a fencer. So what are the animals? The lynx is for clear eyesight, that the lynx is understood to be able to see very well.
Mm-hmm.
The lion and the tiger are swiftness and courage. So the fencer needs both of those. And the elephant is stability, right? So that, you need to have a proper stance, and you need to, have your good interest of those. And the elephant is stability, right? So that, you need to have a proper stance, and you need to, have your good footing and so forth. So this will, I hope, be entertaining. So I, as the medievalist, and interested in the monastic discipline of training the soul, and what these virtues would be, and also interested in the way in which medieval monks tended to talk about themselves as spiritual warriors. There's a line in the Rule of Saint Benedict, how we're putting on the strong, bright weapons of obedience to do battle for Christ the King. Mm-hmm. I show up at the fencing stall where I wanted to start taking fencing lessons with all of this in my head, and said, I want to learn to fence because there's this diagram. and I'm still, in fact, training with the same fencing teacher, then Bakit Abdikilov, who's he's from Kazakhstan but immigrated here. Many of our teachers in fencing are from Eastern Europe or from the former Soviet Union. He's like, okay.
I'm sure he gets all kind of reasons of why people want to start fencing, but I'm sure that one was pretty novel.
I'm here with this diagram from this 15th century fencing manual that I want to learn these virtues. Mm-hmm. I started the blog about 5 years after I started training as a fencer to express some of these spiritual lessons that I was gaining through, in fact, learning this this physical practice, right? So there's a discipline of self that goes into the physical training, and clearly in the Middle Ages, I mean, there's a sort of fantasy that modern martial artists often carry with them about the great spiritual lessons that you get in samurai fighting or in other martial arts. Well, it's similar in the West, right? There are spiritual underpinnings to the way in which medieval knights thought of themselves as warriors, armed with virtue, armed with God. And I started the blog Fencing Bear at Prayer to articulate some of those connections that I was experiencing.
So this is very interesting to me because even though I am not a fencer, I'm a big Thomist. In fact, it was Aquinas, in the study of Aquinas, who I revered for many years. He was like the guy that helped me to see value in philosophy after so many years of struggling to do that. And he, of course, is big on the virtues. So help me make some of those connections. What are some of the things that fencing and the development of virtue, and you say vices too, what are some of these lessons?
We're reading Aquinas for my class just this next week, and we're gonna focus on fortitude. So I had there's several layers there. You recognize already. Anything you ask me has sort of symbolic layers at many different levels. So I'll try to keep them straight. There was so there's two. Let me think. There's two. There's the Desert Fathers, who are the earliest monastics in the Christian tradition. They lived in cells in the Egyptian desert, and there's a sort of mystery, sort of puzzles. Like, what are they doing out there in their cells? Praying psalms daily and sort of removed from everyday life. And the way that they described it. It's particularly in the life of Saint Anthony. If you've seen that famous engraving of Antony surrounded by all the demons, it's a 16th century engraving, but he's sort of suspended in the air. That in ancient thought, the things that he's fighting are both his own thoughts, these logismoi, their thoughts, and actual demons, right? And one of the sort of interesting features of the Desert Fathers talking about their own battle with vices, and in fact, our sense of the seven deadly sins comes from one of these monastic fathers, Evagrius Ponticus, where he says, there are these 8 deadly thoughts. There are 8 of them, not 7, which is what we end up with in the West. And it's clear that they're both interior and exterior, right? They're things that you are tempted by in yourself, and they're actual demons. Like, so they're spiritual beings outside of you. And in ancient thinking, the demons are believed to live in the desert, right? So you basically go into the desert to find opponents.
A sparring ring, yeah.
Basically, yes. It's like, there's a post.
Sparring ring, yeah.
Basically, yes. It's like, there's a post very early on in my blog called Into the Desert, where I talk through all of this tradition that the monks are out there being tempted, and they go there to be tempted, right? So, and this, I think, it's a good metaphor for us as athletes and as fencers or martial artists, that you step on the strip expecting the bout, right? And you need the bout, not just you expect it, you welcome it, you want it to be strong, right? You want your opponent to be, in fact, the best fencer you could possibly be fencing. It's nice if they're only a little bit better than you are, because you at least have a chance. But you don't actually enjoy it as much if your opponent is weaker than you are, because the stronger opponent draws you out, right? It draws on your abilities. When I'm competing, I'm fencing against women, but when we're practicing, it's whoever's there to practice with, and you want your opponent to. It draws on your abilities. When I'm competing, I'm fencing against women, but when we're practicing, it's whoever's there to practice with, and you want your opponent to challenge you, right? And the monks are doing that too. They want, they go into the desert expecting the demons to challenge them, and they get stronger and stronger and stronger, and the demons get stronger the more they battle, right? So there's that one layer of you're sort of putting yourself in a situation as a fencer, expecting to be challenged and to then be faced with all of your weaknesses. So what are those weaknesses? Well, that's very early on. I started the blog with this sort of thought. It's like, great, I'm going to teach you lessons, right? Well, almost immediately that summer, I went to one of our summer national tournaments and lost badly, because you do that a lot.
I'm familiar.
Yes, and I'm sitting there, literally eaten up with envy. It's like seeing this woman who I wanted to be able to beat. I'd been able to beat her before, and she did really well that day. And I'm pounding out this answer on the blog about, I can't remember what that post is titled, but it's something like envy, right? And it was the first of lessons in fact, going through all of the 7 deadly sins over the next several years, that I had to face my envy of, both in scholarship and in fencing, of people that apparently are, progressing faster than I am. That's usually what I feel like. It's like, why are you there and I'm not? I've been working just as hard as you are. Pride, obviously, when you get I had a t-shirt that was like the 7 deadly fencing sins, and pride is, it was good. It's a little shirt. It's got devil on the front and the list on the back. You get on the strip thinking you ought to win. You never ought to win. That's your, and that you have to be there in the bout, willing to have that encounter. If you get on thinking you deserve win, you never ought to win. That's your, and that you have to be there in the bout, willing to have that encounter. If you get on thinking you deserve anything in that, forget it. And so forth. And over the course of the next several years, I found myself, in fact, confronted by all of these sins, like almost as if I'd prayed for it to happen.
Yeah, that's funny how that can really seem to happen. It's almost like once you're willing to take it on, it actually does. It actually comes, and those challenges come. I've noticed that too, and I really like the fencing analogy, because I had Father Joseph White on the podcast recently, and he kept calling specifically hope, the theological virtue, the fighter's virtue, and I think that's that's a really, not just for hope, I mean fortitude as well. There's a really strong connection and picture, I think, that could be painted through things like fencing, martial arts, boxing, even weight was useful for me. My conversion story was very procedural. For many years, I would have considered myself an atheist. Started studying natural theology, came into Aquinas, kind of moved through the phases of agnosticism, and just got to a mere Christianity, and then from there, really lean Protestant for a while. I had every bias you could imagine against the Catholic Church, as a lot of people do. But Scott Hahn was one of the people who was helpful to me in settling a number of arguments. So anyways, he shared one of your articles, and that was like, all right, I have to reach out to Professor Brown at this point. There's too many coincidences. And that article was detailing your conversion story that you wrote. So Explain that to me, maybe more of your personal background, faith background, because you weren't always a Catholic. I think have you already been confirmed, or where are you at in the process, and how did it happen? What's the story there? What did it have to do with your studies of Mary, or take us through it?
Okay, so I'm happy that you found it through Scott, because he and I actually had a lovely conversation this summer, and his story and my story are very similar. That we both grew up Presbyterian, which is delightful. And I was actually I've been aware of his work for a long time, particularly his work, his book on Hail Holy Queen. It's interesting how these things, they float around the internet, and I'd seen his description of Mary as Ark in a blog post or something, and that he develops that in the book. And that was, in fact, the exact image that I was working to elucidate in the book that I just finished last year on Mary and the Art of Prayer. That when he and I were talking, it was very interesting, because both of us, growing up Presbyterian, the Presbyterians are very, very interested in Scripture. Mm-hmm. As a denomination, a tradition, very, very proud of learning. This is my father was a lot of this is coming from my father too. Not that he was like particularly learned in Scripture, but he was always the one that was going, the Presbyterians are the origin of democracy. And I've since learned that he's actually right on that. The Scots' influence on the development of American Scripture, but he was always the one that was going, the Presbyterians are the origin of democracy. And I've since learned that he's actually right on that. The Scots' influence on the development of American sense of, common sense, and our philosophy and such is very, very Scottish Enlightenment. Mm-hmm. But my dad was also always like, the one that always pushes me. It's like, why, right? Why, what does all of this mean? What is spirituality? What is prayer? Dad had his own struggles. And so, that was, it was inspiring to me, but, and that my dad was always very strong on saying, that we Presbyterians are the ones that always ask the questions, right? We want to study the text. We want to wrestle with the problems. And it seemed to me in talking to Scott that he had a similar experience. So growing up with that kind of focus, when I was in college, I took a number of courses in New Testament. I started in math and physics, and then found that I was actually better at thinking about symbols and stories than about symbols and analysis.
Interesting. I like that.
In fact, I miss my dad, because he was an amateur mathematician as well, and I think the sort of desire to find form and proof through mathematics is very similar to the kind of work I do in history. Mm-hmm. So I did a number of courses in New Testament, in Jesus and history, and the Synoptic Gospels and the Pauline letters, with Werner Kelber, who was a very, very great teacher in Scripture. And one of the things that Professor Kelber showed us was the way in which the Gospel of Mark had a very strong narrative structure. That was what he himself was working on. I was also at the time interested in structure. That was what he himself was working on. I was also at the time interested in the Middle Ages, partly because I'd had a great Latin teacher in high school, and I took a course on medieval Latin. And all of these, you realize, like I said, everything to me is always, you need a diagram, and then it starts turning into a sort of networked image, and then you realize pieces all come together. So I had the Scripture studies, the Latin. I had a very good teacher in medieval history, Sharon Farmer, who's at UC Santa Barbara now, who did a course on women in the Middle Ages. And we did a section on Mary, right? And what Sharon told us was she wasn't really sure what she could she could assign to us to read on Mary, because there wasn't really any scholarship, curiously. And it was like all of these things came together in one moment, right? I was reading Bernard of Clairvaux's sermons on Mary, and I did a little paper on Bernard. And from there, I started getting the sense of what I'd grown up hearing about Mary was almost nothing, right? It was interesting. What Bernard says Mary is of course, is the thing that on which salvation hinges.
Mm-hmm.
And he's reading the scriptures in this way that I wasn't really familiar with. So when I started my graduate work, the first thing I sort of stumbled on was this commentary on the Song of Songs that was written as a dialogue between Christ and Mary. It's written in the late 12th century by a man from near York, William of Newborough. And I took this text that I found to my supervisor, my graduate supervisor. Then I said, I want to work on this. And he says, I found that kind of dull. And I said, fine, that's what I'm working on. You say it's dull. I'm going to figure out why it's exciting and interesting. And, and of course, I feel like, that's a long path, but throughout all of that, I feel like I was guided, right? That there's all these little pieces of, I needed to care about scripture. I needed to care about history. I needed to care about the patterns. I needed to care about a certain about scripture. I needed to care about history. I needed to care about the patterns. I needed to care about a certain sense of reality that I had not been able to access through my science studies or, the sort of ordinary secular training you were getting. And I think that I was drawn to work on that William Newborough commentary is the most sort of astonishing thing in the story of all, because I didn't know anything about it, right? And I just found it. And since then I've been working on the scriptural bases for devotion to Mary in the Middle Ages. And that's taken me 30 years. And when I finished my book, that I just finished on Mary and the Art of Prayer, I felt like I'd finally gotten a grasp on what all that scriptural imagery was. And coincidentally, I had started writing about Milo, which I saw him playing with and playing out. And I mean, he and I are great friends now, partly because he does sort of symbolic things with his costumes and his speeches and his performances. And I say, oh yes, there you're embodying Revelation. There you're, and of course he's also Catholic. And so I was in conversation with him and I made some joke to him at one point about, I don't know what we were joking about, but I was saying he wanted to get a dog. And I'm like, well, you get a dog, I'll convert. And he says, I'm getting a dog. And I'm like, fine, I guess it's my turn.
All right, so we have to take a pause. The story is too good. So a lot of people listening are going to have a lot of different ideas of Milo. So you're talking about Milo Yiannopoulos, one of the most controversial figures of the past couple of years, especially in politics. You've gotten to become great. All right, so now we have to take a couple of detours, but we'll bring it all back around, I promise. So, all right, first off, what's the connection there? How did you get to be great friends with Milo Yiannopoulos of all people? And then two, having become great friends with him, what is it that people should really know about him? How should people really see him? And then three, let's loop it back into the conversion story, because you also wrote the foreword to his upcoming book, which is highly relevant to Catholicism as well. So I just dumped a lot more on you. Take it however you want.
So I teach at the University of Chicago, and 2 years ago, our dean of students sent out a letter to our incoming freshmen, our incoming class, saying this was in the midst of all of the sort of trigger warnings and safe spaces concerns in 2016. And Jay Ellison sent a letter to our incoming class saying, at Chicago, we value rigorous debate and, do not expect to find trigger warnings on your syllabi or safe spaces on our campus. Given what I said about myself as a fencer, and welcoming debate and welcoming competition, you recognize that I am very sympathetic to that as a model for intellectual life as well, right? Not just our spiritual life or our physical training, but indeed our training as scholars. And I'd already been caught up in some stuff on the blog about cheering for Western civilization. And I was somewhat aware that year, because that was the year Milo was doing his Dangerous Faggot tour. Mm-hmm. I was aware that, his talks had created some controversy. And so I was like, well, I'd study medieval Christianity, and one, as a scholar of medieval Christianity, I'm used to people lying or telling tall tales about the past. I spent a lot of my life trying to correct some of those stories. I figured, no one should be condemned as a heretic without a proper inquisition.
Yeah,
Inquisition.
Yeah, we're gonna have to come back to all that stuff too. You just opened up a whole bunch, but we'll stay on target.
There we go. So this is. So I said, okay, I'm going to go watch some of his videos, right? And I take it that it's because I've been studying medieval biblical exegesis for 30 years that I was able to see what he was doing in a way that it seems almost nobody else could, which was playing a holy fool, a sort of provocateur kind of clown, in order to point to spiritual realities. Mm-hmm. And in fact, one of the earliest posts I did about him was on that theme, right? Kung Fu Panda, which was seeing him through the lens of the Kung Fu Panda movies. Mm-hmm. I called it Kung Fu Milo. Sorry, Kung Fu Milo, mm-hmm. It was a joke on the Kung Fu Panda movies. That Milo has a really, it's uncanny, although it's purposeful, although he often tells me that I see things in his canny, although it's purposeful, although he often tells me that I see things in his use of symbolism that he's not even completely aware of. That he's so imbued with, I guess, from his training as a chorister at Canterbury. He's saying at Canterbury, he trained as a chorister and he's done performances at Canterbury when he was younger. His growing up Catholic with his grandmother as his primary caregiver, he simply stepped into this kind of understanding of the way in which you show the joy of Christianity through laughter and these characters that he was putting on. I've articulated that more fully now, but when I wrote to him, I just said, dear Mr. Yiannopoulos, I teach at the University of Chicago. You may have heard about this letter that just went out. And I explained to him some of the stuff that I had done in favor of Western civilization. And he wrote back, and, quite quickly we realized that there was a lot of things that we could help each other with in terms of the conversation that we were in. Mm. And I started blogging about what I saw in his performances and giving him some sort of advice as a teacher on aspects of history of Christianity that he wanted to develop in his talks. And so we've been friends since then.
Yeah, what a fascinating story. And so first off, it was recent news to me, actually, that I'll admit that I never followed Milo that closely, so I don't have all that many informed things to say. But learning that he was Catholic and then reading about that was very interesting to me. That was something that I did not know. So it sounds like he actually played. Did he play more of a significant role in your conversion process than just making the bet with the dog? Or
well,
it sounds like he actually played. Did he play more of a significant role in your conversion process than just making the bet with the dog? Or
well, the thing is, I think all of these things were coming together at the appropriate time. I do. It's my study of this tradition for 30 years and my interest in understanding Mary's role in Christianity, and the fact that I was finishing the book literally the same moment. I turned the manuscript in. Actually, there's a little more in the conversion moment that I was turning the manuscript in November, about almost exactly 2 years ago, for going to press. And I was invited to give a lecture at St. Louis University, in St. Louis. And I was talking to Milo at that point, and I was telling him about giving the talk. And I was actually born in St. Louis. My parents were in medical school at Washington University about my book that was coming out. The students were very good hosts, and they took me to campus. I'd never seen Washington campus, and in fact drove me to see the apartment building where I was a baby. That was interesting. And so it just felt like there was all this sort of sense of homecoming. And then my guest, Tom Madden, who is a great historian of the Crusades, took me out to dinner with him and his Catholic friends. It's like it was irresistible by that point. So the joke with the dog came in the context of, a sense that I'd completed a journey and was sort of coming full circle in a lot of ways. And that having completed the book sitting on the outside, it was time to step in. Right. And you'll appreciate if you read my book, which I hope some of your listeners are interested to look at. I set up the book as an exercise in stepping into the light, right? You say you came through sort of mere Christianity, which means essay called Meditation in a Tool Shed. Are you familiar with that?
Yeah, with the dust and the light. Yep.
The dust and the light. And I say this is the challenge for us as scholars, right? Understanding faith. That for your listeners that don't know the essay, Lewis says he had this moment when he was standing in his tool shed, right? And it was dark in the tool shed, the door was closed, and there's this beam of light coming down through the crack in the top of the door. And standing outside of the beam, he could see the light itself and dust motes dancing in it and stuff like that, but nothing else, right? It's just the beam of light in the darkness. And then he stepped into the light, which you recognize is a very particular metaphor that he's using, steps into the light. And then when the light hits his eyes, he can look along the beam and see the trees outside or the leaves. And then, as he lovely says, because he always has these celestial meditations on his mind too, 93 million miles away, the sun, right? And this I found, he then goes on to meditate on what this shows us about the human sciences, that the social sciences like pretending that standing outside the beam is the only vision of reality that you can have access to, that the anthropologist, stands outside the person performing the religious ritual and sees someone dancing for, fertility or something. But the person performing the rite, understands it as a particular communication with the divine. The psychologist will see something from the outside that the lover who sees the beloved won't be able to see, and so forth. And Lewis is saying, this to me is resonant, that we in the academy privilege those who stand outside the light all the time. We in the academy privilege those who stand outside the light all the time, right? We say those who want to understand religious practice or behavior are best doing it from the outside. And Lewis is saying, well, but the believer sees something from the inside that you cannot see when you're simply standing outside. And he also points out that, of course, everybody's always standing inside some perspective, that it's not like you as the anthropologist have no frame of reference that you're using. And his call was to be able to practice using both, right? To contrast them, to step into the light, understand that things you see by faith are real in ways that those looking from them only from the outside simply can't have access to. And I use that little essay and I use that image at the beginning of my book to say, this book is an invitation to step inside, right? It's an invitation to step inside the beam of devotion to Mary. And so my book is in fact this exercise of stepping in and trying to show you that reality. And I say that's why I was able to see what Milo was doing, because I think, Milo and we both stand in the faith. And if you watch him from within the faith, you see a different person from the ones who only see his antics.
Yeah, that's so, opened up a million more doors there. So, so my wife and I are doing a Marian consecration now. It's just wonderful. The prayers and everything are wonderful, which is one of the many, many reasons I wanted to talk to you. So let's go that direction now, if we can, for a minute, because I heard you make a pretty interesting claim one time that I didn't get to hear you explore all that deeply, but just because the nature of the show is on our friend Tom Wood's show, you probably remember what I'm talking about. You, and correct me if I'm misremembering, but you're a defender of Western civilization, rightfully so, I would argue. But you also, I think you made the claim that and correct me if I'm misremembering, but you're a defender of Western civilization, rightfully so, I would argue. But you also, I think you made the claim that you said that it was going to be Mary who would save Western civilization. Did you say that?
Oh, yes.
Okay. All right. So we gotta go into it now. All right. So. And maybe it's going to take some wind up, because there's going to be a lot of people here who maybe are totally standing outside the light. They maybe have some fleeting cultural reference of Mary. Maybe
right.
People from a Protestant perspective who certainly don't see Mary in the same way that the Catholics see. So you tell me what the best way to approach this is, but I found that to be a very interesting statement, and I want to see where you go with it.
So the best place to start for Americans is probably Henry Adams. His autobiography, Henry Adams, was apparently one of the most popular books of the 20th century. Although since we're in the 21st century, it's not clear to me And he describes in his autobiography how he sort of grew up. He had his religious education only to 12 or 13 and then basically had nothing, right? Mm-hmm. And then later in his life, he was visiting France, and he was there in 1900 for the Great Exposition, one of the world's fairs, and went to the Hall of Machines and sort of has this moment where he's meditating on the mystery of the electric dynamo, right? It's sort of this great force that he feels and sees in the great whirling wheel. On that same tour, he went on a tour of the cathedrals in northern France, most famously to Chartres. And he has this line that I often reflect on from his autobiography. All the steam in the world, which is what the steam that the dynamo generates, right? It's to power engines, right? Mm-hmm. All the steam in the world could not, like the Virgin, build shots, right? It's to power engines, right? Mm-hmm. All the steam in the world could not, like the Virgin, build shot. Mm. And it's kind of a complicated meditation, because he's on the one hand thinking of Mary as a symbol of woman and the feminine, and that is not in fact the fullness of the way in which she's understood in the Middle Ages when they built Chartres. But it is an understanding that there's some kind of force or energy in human life that is beyond the mechanical, right? There is a sort of spiritual life that we have curiously lost access to. You can go through the Enlightenment and figure that out. But and in his he wrote a follow-up book about his experience on Mont Saint-Michel and Chartres, and describing the imagery that he found in the cathedral and what he thought it was. And it's interesting to read that, because he sees Mary in the sort of caricature version that I think many modern Christians still carry with them, and it's to a certain extent a legacy of the 19th century, that they've just lost access to much of the theological mystery that she is a frame for. Adams has this claim in Mont Saint-Michel and Chartres, where Chartres is only about Mary and pleasing her, because she's the woman who loves color and light, and the queen who favors her devotees and has no business with the theologians, mm-hmm. And that there's no image of the Trinity at the cathedral. Well, but what's sort of disingenuous of Adams is that he also quotes a sequence by a very great 12th century composer, Adam of St. Victor, where he calls her the triclinium Trinitatis, the chamber of the Trinity. Mm. The Trinitarian image is everywhere at Chartres. You just can't see it if you're not looking along the beam, mm-hmm. as Adams clearly wasn't, right? He was looking at it as a work of art and as a kind of frippery, or he was impressed by it, right? He wanted to be impressed by it, but he couldn't see it. The way in which medieval Christians see Mary is she is the one who makes visible the God whom the world had not seen. And there's a prayer by Anselm of Canterbury, the great Archbishop of Canterbury, mm-hmm. that you showed to the world the Creator whom it had not seen. And what I try to show in my book, Mary and the Art of Prayer, is the way in which the way that medieval Christians read Scripture and prayed to her was as a frame for the contemplation of God. Many modern Christians, and I've had some interesting arguments in my social media recently about this.
I bet you have.
Many modern Christians, insist that no, Mary, praying to Mary or through Mary or with Mary as an intercessor is, idolatry or blasphemy. Because that's, replacing the creator with the creature. And the entire point of the Orthodox and medieval devotion to Mary is that she reveals the creator, right? Mm-hmm. You meditate on her as the throne of wisdom, as the Ark of the Covenant, as the shrine in which God becomes present, the Holy of Holies, precisely because through the incarnation, she shows God to the world, right? Mm-hmm. And there's a through to, just like physically practical, she gives birth to Christ. Mm-hmm. And that's the great mystery that is, of course, acknowledged at the Council of Ephesus in 431, that she is the mother of God. She's not just the mother of Jesus or the mother of Christ. She's the Theotokos, because she is the holy temple in which the Lord makes himself present and visible to the world. And that is, of course, the great basis for Christian art, that it's incarnational, that you can paint Christ at the second person, because Jesus is God and man, right? He's visible and therefore pointing to the divinity.
Mm-hmm.
There's a big debate in the Orthodox Church about this, about the 9th century.
Yep.
The iconoclastic debate.
Mm-hmm.
And all of this is coming together in the architecture and art and symbolism of the great cathedrals, like J.R.R to say, this is the visible mystery pointing to the invisible reality. And Mary is the in the art in which she's shown in the period. She's I was just giving a talk to my parish. I was just giving a talk to my parish a night or so ago, and I was showing them some of the pictures from my book. And one is from a psalter from the 12th century in England. It's a Shaftesbury psalter, and Mary is seated in a sort of architectural frame that is clearly meant to be set in heaven, right? So there's this sort of frame around her, and there's a blue framing her. But then Christ seated on her lap is framed by her cloak in the same blue. She's heaven, right? She is the one who contains the creator whom the heavens themselves could not contain. And that's the mystery that I try to show through the readings of the prayers to her in my book, particularly the Office of the Virgin, which is the practice that medieval Christians said with their books of hours, right? If you've seen a medieval manuscript, you've probably seen a book of hours, because these are the prayer books that both clergy and laity had in the later Middle Ages to suggest we should in my book. You understand that the whole Office of the Virgin is in fact a framing of praise to God. So I'd say most modern my parishioners seem happy with this as a representation of the medieval devotion, but most of them hadn't heard it before. They know to say things like the Ave Maria as part of a practice with the Rosary, but the Ave Maria is itself only the introduction to the Office of the Virgin, and the full office is this framing of God.
Mm-hmm. So this is part of the reason this is really interesting to me. Well, I mean, for one, even before I became Catholic, and even though I, again, held just about every possible animosity that you could imagine, I always had this very interesting pull, this very strange pull toward the Blessed Mother, toward the Virgin Mary, that I could, and same with my wife. I mean, I remember my pull, this very strange pull toward the Blessed Mother, toward the Virgin Mary, that I could, and same with my wife. I mean, I remember my wife, because she's a convert too, and she's like, we finally got to the point where like, okay, let's go to church. She said, fine, any church, but not a Catholic church. Anything but a Catholic church. But she too always had this incredible pull to Mary, even apart from that. So of course, now that we're in the church, we've just been diving into these Marian devotions. We're doing the consecration now, and it's so rich and it's so wonderful. It's been so rewarding in so many different ways. But you made a good point where you said that this isn't something that's been lost outside of the church. It's something that's been lost in the church as well, very much so. Do you have any thoughts on why that is, how that happened, and then go back to your original point, now that you've given us a background of how Mary is going to be the savior of Western civilization?
Right. So, talking about a great work from the 17th century called The Mystical City of God, that was written by a Spanish nun she wrote it in Spanish, right, in the early 17th century. And it's a wonderful, it's 4 volumes, right? It's huge. And it's a wonderful meditation on the life of Mary. The woman who wrote it is called herself Mary. So Sor Maria is a better way to say Sister Mary, wrote this book in which she says, Mary came to her and inspired her to write her full life. But what I recognized when I read it is that it's completely grounded in this scriptural tradition that I've been showing, particularly Mary as wisdom, that she's the wisdom is described in Proverbs, dancing before the Lord at creation. She's the bride that you see in Revelation. She's the image of the heavenly Jerusalem, described in Proverbs, dancing before the Lord at creation. She's the bride that you see in Revelation. She's the image of the heavenly Jerusalem. She's the bride in the Song of Songs. She's the wisdom in Ecclesiasticus. And all of that imagery feeds into Sor Maria's description of Mary being prepared to be the temple of God, right? And there's this wonderful meditation that she has of the 9 days before the Annunciation. Mary is taken up into heaven in an abstractive vision and herself shown the mysteries of creation. So the first 6 days of the novena, she has these 9 days, this novena. The first 6 days, she's shown the works of all the creation, right? So she, in effect, learns all astronomy, all geography, all botany, all biology, because she herself is going to be filled with the Creator, right? So she is filled with the knowledge of all creation. And then for 3 days, she's prepared as the bride, and then she's sort of gilded perfectly. And the Trinity says, you're prepared. 19th century is a great work of theology by bishops and throughout Spain. It's unfortunately tainted with the argument that they're having at the time about whether Mary is immaculately conceived. And Sor Maria was a nun in the order of the Immaculate Conception, so you could see which side she was on. And that means that it gets caught up in that doctrinal controversy. In the 18th century, it has an even more exciting existence that Casanova, the great lover and sinner, is given this book to read while he's imprisoned in Venice for trying to fornicate with nuns. And he has this, but this is, you can see, Casanova is a very good example of what happens in the Enlightenment, right? Because he writes himself this autobiography, which it's interesting to think, he's writing his autobiography. He has this, but this is, you can see, Casanova is a very good example of what happens in the Enlightenment, right? Because he writes himself this autobiography, which it's interesting to think, he's writing his autobiography and given Sor Maria's autobiography of Mary, as it were, to read, while he's himself meditating on what it is to be a self, and he's given this book to read by the Inquisitor, and he says it nearly drove him mad. He says, it's like they were torturing me with these fantasies, right? Only Sor Maria herself must have gone crazy, because how else could she have come up with this fantastic sort of delusion that Mary came to talk to her, and that she was able to write this 4-volume account of Mary's experience. Voltaire echoed Casanova's mocking, saying, this stuff is crazy. And it's after that it's very interesting. It's like the church kind of stuff is crazy. And it's after that it's very interesting. It's like the church kind of drops it. I'm not quite sure why, but the mocking that this tradition is given in the Enlightenment certainly has an effect on it. So that by the 19th century, you end up with what I see as this amazingly impoverished tradition, that the split between reason and emotion, which, we're still dealing with, right? The Enlightenment philosophers are all about, focusing on reason as the only true test of truth. And the romantics come back and say, no, it's feelings. And you can recognize that sort of split to this day in the way in which people talk about their religious faith, right? Do you know the truth because you felt it, because you've experienced it, because it's highly personal, or can you reason with it? Well, science got that part of the equation, and so we end up with a ridiculous argument that science and reason are at odds with each other. They're not. Christianity of the scientific method that modern science depends upon, because it's grounded in this expectation that as Mary, in becoming the mother of God, is filled with the knowledge of creation, right? And that's, in fact, Sor Maria is very interesting, because who she wanted to be was she wanted to be a missionary, but the Franciscans weren't recruiting women to go into the desert in New Mexico to preach to the pueblos. So she went there anyway, in bilocation, right? There's stories of her appearing to the Humanos Indians. This is another of my closing stories, right? Apparently, Sor Maria appears in vision to the people who were living outside of the city where I grew up, in northern Texas, right outside of what is now Amarillo, Texas. Whereas where I was studying Latin in high school, right, there's a tradition that the lady in blue appeared to the Humanos, who then went to Santa Fe and asked for baptism. Right? So Maria, in order to be, and she wanted to go there. She wanted to go to in the great missionary activity of the Spanish in the 17th century, because she'd read all this geography, right? She'd read about the history of the peoples who the discoveries of the Europeans were encountering, and so when she's describing Mary's being filled with knowledge of creation and astronomy, geography, she's obviously talking about her own reading. But it's this twinning of heaven and earth, this desire for knowledge twinned with the reality of the incarnation. That is the great mystery that I think modernity ruptured, right? And so when I say Mary will save us, it's what I mean is this vision of creation, the vision of the Creator entering into his creation through Mary, recognize her as the mother of the Word, which means she's the mother of the language arts. She's the mother of the trivium, which means grammar, rhetoric, and logic. She is filled with the knowledge of the verbal arts. Obviously, she's the mother of the Word. But they also think of her as filled with the knowledge of all of the other arts. So she's filled with the mathematical disciplines of the quadrivium. She knows law. She knows theology. She knows the angels. In order to describe her, you have to write an encyclopedia. And one of the things that I show in my book is the way in which, indeed, in the 13th century, we have these descriptions of Mary, which are basically natural histories, right? To describe her, you need to describe all the trees by which she is named in Ecclesiasticus. You need to describe all the places in Scripture in which God becomes present on his mountain, in the river, in the cloud. You need to describe the heavens because God makes the heavens. So she is, in fact, you meditate on her, you have to meditate on the whole of creation. Mm-hmm. And it's that understanding of the this is really a theme for our discussion today, right? The microcosm is pointing to the macrocosm. The she as the mother of God points us to the creation of which he is the maker.
Yeah, and that resonates with me deeply on many levels. One is just all the prayers I'm going through right now. These devotions is just meditating on Mary as all of these things. Seat of wisdom, Ark of the Covenant, so on and so forth. Everything you're just describing. But even my personal history and journey. When I first started studying philosophy, I began with a lot of the existentialists, which quickly leads to various forms, or just at least one form, if you will, of nihilism. Mm-hmm. And the separation that you were talking about, and this kind of period I spent as an atheist trying to make sense of every basic intuition that I had with a worldview that essentially precluded all of them, morality, reason, free will, so on or so forth. And it wasn't until I finally got all the way back around through the moderns, through the Enlightenment philosophers, to Aristotle, and then eventually Aquinas, that I think what you're describing finally happened for me, if that makes sense.
It makes sense. Yes.
Mm-hmm. Like almost exactly as you're describing. I didn't link it to Mary in the way that you've just described, but what you just described was what happened to me, where I felt like, oh, finally things are making sense. Finally things that were separated before don't need to be separated any longer. They're being reconciled. That's fascinating. I'm glad I asked you that question, because it's been in the back of my mind ever since you stated that, but then didn't get to go into it. So thank you.
Well, I'm glad you asked, because indeed, so my next step is, in my first book, I talk about the Song of Songs commentaries and the way in which they reveal a relationship between Christ and Mary as medieval Christians understood it. And the second book, I'm showing you this system of images by which Mary, right? And in fact, my book is basically meditation on the Hail Mary. And there's the greeting, how you greet Mary and how you name her. Mm-hmm. And now what I recognize is the next step, and this is why I'm doing the Virtues and Vices course, is to understand, in fact, the way which Mary shows us a model for how to train the soul. And that's my blog tag is Training the Soul. Medievalist musings on training the soul in the postmodern West. And it's, you realize all these layers of work that I've been doing on myself as a fencer, in my scholarship in understanding Mary, ultimately ends up in this: how do you train the soul in virtue, which I'd say is the thing that we're missing in modern culture, right? If you think about virtue signaling, what are we signaling, right? That has nothing to do with signaling your character, your skills, your self-discipline. It's all about signaling this identity categories that are meant to be simply what you're born with, right? And the tradition of Christian thinking is, well, one, it's scientific in the sense that you're studying the created world, but it's also a training of the self, which is what those monks are doing out in the desert, right? They're going out into the desert in early Christianity and training themselves in fighting these demons, training themselves to deal with their own temptations and weaknesses. And that's in fact the very first post, 2 posts I wrote in responding to Milo's talks. One was called Safe Spaces versus Sacred Spaces, in which I made the argument that, well, yes, on university campuses, we shouldn't have safe spaces in the sense of places where you're prevented from dealing with dangerous stuff. You should have sacred spaces, which is why the sacred is very dangerous, right? That's why you put a perimeter around it, or you consecrate the church. Dangerous things happen when you come into contact with the holy. When, for example, when David is having the ark brought up to Jerusalem and Obed-Edom touches it, he dies, right? The sacred, when you come into contact with it, is terrifying and awesome and wondrous and frightening. And that's what it feels like confronting knowledge, right? That's what it should feel. That's what it should feel like in the classroom. And I did a little meditation in that post on the way Tolkien talks about the purpose of life and what education means and how we get to it. But that you should feel yourself in the classroom, given the opportunity to embrace that transcendence, which never happens, right? Because we're always standing outside the beam. And then the second post I did was in response to that GIF that was going around of the young woman in the talk at Amherst when Christina Hoff Sommers and Stephen Crowder and Milo appeared together. And as Christina was talking, there's a woman in the audience saying, "Keep this hate speech off your campus. Keep this hate speech off our campus." And it turned into a little meme, Trigglypuff, the Trigglypuff meme, right? And I've and what I called it was post is some advice to Trigglypuff and her teachers. And I was saying there's 2 things that are the answer to this problem. The first is learn to sit with your emotions, right? The training of the emotions is something we have literally given up it completely, right? It's like kids throwing temper tantrums. The kids that Milo used to show in his campus talks, the sort of opening that he used for the campus talks, are these it's often on young women, embarrassingly enough, throwing temper. It's like kids throwing temper tantrums. The kids that Milo used to show in his campus talks, the sort of opening that he used for the campus talks, are these it's often on young women, embarrassingly enough, throwing temper tantrums. Right. I remember this one girl flinging this trash can around, and we've seen some of those temper tantrums again after the Kavanaugh hearings, and people are flinging themselves against doors and screaming and yelling and saying, "Meh." It's like, these are temper tantrums. These are people who have not learned to sit with their emotions. And then the second thing is, and the blog is a lot about that, right? Training yourself to deal with the disappointment, the frustration, the not being what you wished you were, not having skills that you wished you had, all those sorts of things. And then the second thing is understanding what it means to train in a skill. And I'm curious. I mean, we seem to have given that up in education, that, you come to me as a student. I expect to give you an exercise that you find challenging. If I'm not giving you a challenging exercise, come to me as a student. I expect to give you an exercise that you find challenging. If I'm not giving you a challenging exercise, I'm not doing my job. If it's a challenging exercise, you are going to have feelings of frustration and fear and anxiety and all sorts of things. I am also here as your teacher to walk you through that path, right? How do you deal with writer's block? How do you deal with not knowing what to write? How do you deal with managing your time, but managing your emotions as well? All of these things, what we've lost in the West is a sense that emotion and reason work together. Right? The Enlightenment took reason, the Romantics took emotion, and somehow we don't realize that the two are actually bound together in the soul.
So let me ask you this before we make sure we tell everybody where they can go devour all of your good works. Is how does one, I guess, would be what would be your prediction, and two is what is the solution here? So we got the generally confused. You brought up this idea of virtue signaling. You ask them what a virtue is, most of them probably couldn't even tell you. I mean, virtue ethics for one is, if you go into most ethics 101 classes, maybe you'll get a chapter on that at most. Forget natural law, which I would argue is the indispensable moral epistemology. It was interesting because I was watching part of your conversation with Gad Saad before this too, and I like that you pushed him on the moral thing. I think he was confused on moral epistemology versus ontology. So I'd like to have you do like a round two with him at some point. But part of that too is, how do you know what the moral values and duties are, what the virtues and vices are? That's question number one. And I don't think people have anything like that. And then two is like, where do you ground them? How are they instantiated? We all have this intuition that some things are right and wrong. But again, these things are never, having spent a lot of time in academia, especially in philosophy departments, I mean, a lot of these things are taboo a lot of the time. We don't have those sacred spaces, or taboo a lot of the time. We don't have those sacred spaces, let alone viewing morality as something that, at least on the cardinal virtues, the theological ones being a little different, there's something, like you said, you have to work at it. You have to be challenged, but you also have to know what you're working at before. It's just such a mess, Professor Brown. It's just such a mess. Like, I agree. I don't even know where to start with it. Like, I do my podcast, I try to teach this stuff, but like, it's just the Enlightenment was obviously was savagely destructive. I mean, through Kant and Hume and all those people for morality in general. I don't think we've recovered. I think we've gotten worse with the modernists, and especially the postmodernists. So you're more in academia than I am. What are your predictions? And two, is there a solution to this?
So academia, we can be despairing about academia, or we can just recognize that institutions have sort of life cycles, not really in the Aristotelian sense, but one of the fun things that you learn if you study the history of monasticism, which are very long-lived institutions, they go through reforms about once every 100 years, right? Particularly in the Middle Ages, right? It's like you have the founding of a lot of the monasteries in the Merovingian period, and then the Carolingians come along and say, oh no, they've all become corrupt, and then a few hundred years later you come with the Hirsau and Gore's reforms, and then you have the Cluniac reform, and then you can do an entire history of monasticism. It's like one reform after another. The sort of high level of training that it clearly takes to be excellent in even these spiritual disciplines is hard to sustain. And so I'd say my university, the University of Chicago, founded in 1892. We're a little ready for a reform, you could say, right? And the reform that academia needs to go through is, clearly people have become more invested in the existence of the institution and its prestige than they have in the reason for the training in the first place, right? That's one of the things that, I mean, it's been exhilarating standing up with Milo against all of this, because you sort of saying, look, it's more important to tell the truth than it is to worry about what effect it's going to have on my reputation, right? Because, and that, of course, is always the great temptation that we are, as social creatures, given, is serve the world rather than the truth. And the world, it means like material world or power or something like that, but it means basically also social approval, right? It's I think, the virtue signaling is trying to get other people to approve you socially and show, people like to be thought lovely, as Adam Smith put it. Yes, people like to be thought lovely, as Adam Smith put it, right? I did a post on why shame works. I'm drawing on his theory of moral sentiments, and he's saying, that's the interesting thing about Adam Smith is a lot of people don't know him as a moral philosopher, but he was. Right. Most of them know him for his economics work. Yeah, he was, and so we were sort of Enlightenment bashing. The Enlightenment's a complicated phenomenon, right? There isn't just the Enlightenment. There's the 18th century, in which there are a number of different philosophical arguments going on, and I referred earlier to the way in which my dad talked about the Presbyterians. That I understand now that. The Presbyterians were trained at Princeton, and in the 18th century, the president of Princeton went to Edinburgh and collected up all these Scots. And the Scots that he collected up had been reading people like Adam Smith, and what he brought back to Princeton and therefore disseminated to all of the Presbyterian, which was founded on this idea that we all have a common sense that gives us moral understanding. So that's why if Americans talk about just use your common sense, it's actually a technical philosophical term that comes from that Scottish enlightened moment. But it's interesting that when we read Adam Smith, typically academically, we don't read both, right? You need both the external virtues of the market, the way in which you deal with each other at a distance, right, as it were, and the social virtues, which are the ones that you develop. Smith talks about in sort of daily life, right? In every little interaction that you have with another human being, you're performing the culture, you're performing the virtues that you need in order to exist socially. And one of the ones that Smith talks about is shame is effective because we all want to think ourselves lovely, by which he means be lovable, right? It's like you want to be loved because we all want to think ourselves lovely, by which he means be lovable, right? It's like you want to be loved. And that's why shame works so well. It's why all of this virtue signaling and political correctness and stuff has such a grip, I think, on, American culture, because we do want to seem lovely. We do want to be considered virtuous. It wouldn't work if we didn't care, right? So, you could say that it's drawing on something that is actually good for us as Americans, which is we want to be, sociable and considered, lovely, right? Part members of the now. That has a bad side because it means that we also then tend to agree with each other even when we don't. And certainly when you are trying to tell people, you're going to need to be uncomfortable if you want to learn this skill. You're going to need to be uncomfortable if you're going to have to actually think through all the new atheists, right? They seem, if they ever went to church or Sunday school, they have a literally prepubescent understanding of theology.
It's that. Or philosophy.
They're like, religion, it's all so stupid. And it's like, yeah, would you like to do science with what you understood about science when you were 10?
I can proudly say this, is that even when I consider myself an atheist, at least I like the old atheists, right? Those were the good ones.
The robust ones.
The robust ones. I never took the new atheists seriously because I couldn't. The only good thing about Sam Harris's book, Letters to a Christian Nation, is that it's short. That's the only thing that it's got going.
Oh, well, don't get me started on Sam Harris.
But, we could do a whole other episode on them. That might be fun.
So you did ask me, so what's the prospect? Well, this is why I love Milo and we're great friends. Chesterton had it right that Christianity is the religion of joy. And asked me, so what's the prospect? Well, this is why I love Milo and we're great friends. Chesterton had it right that Christianity is the religion of joy. And what we should witness as Christians is our joy. And you do that. There's reason that Dante's greatest work is the Divine Comedy. He didn't call it the Divine Comedy. He just called it the Commedia. It's because it's the story of our salvation and our joy. And what we need as Christians to do is share that joy with the world. So you go into the world witnessing to the delight that God became incarnate through the Virgin Mary, became one of us, and by that invited us to become artists and creators with him.
It's funny that we're having this conversation now because we're about on my 1-year anniversary, if we can call it that, of becoming a Christian, when I stepped into the light and everything changed. I mean, everything changed for me when I did that. Even when I had the sort of intellectual moves figured out, I thought, there's still that actually coming into the light, right? That full ascent. So it's just, what the heck was my thought going to be at that point? I actually did have a point. Yes, here's the point. So even though everything changed and it brought this incredible new joy to my life, didn't necessarily make everything easier. A lot of times it made things harder because like, oh shoot, I do have a lot of things I got to work on, right? So a lot of things became more difficult, but by the grace of God, you can get it done. Now I just lost the thought again. Can you believe it?
I filled you with this giddiness, right?
That's it.
Like,
That's
just
it. I got it
remember
back.
that.
I got it back. You got me the giddiness. So I got the giddiness. Everything became so much better. I felt like, okay, it makes sense through and through. Things became more difficult. But then speaking of reforms going on in the Catholic Church, so that's one of those things that a lot of people, I think, here's a problem I think happens that even happened to me, is like you find this wonderful, beautiful, great, good thing, right? And then you want to be able to rest in it and enjoy it. And then you realize, oh my goodness, the house is a mess. The ark smells, right?
Filled with animals.
Filled with animals. And you're like, oh, I have all this that I got to deal with and worry about. So tell us what this is about. And I want to make sure that we direct people in all the right places and where
Excellent.
to get it and all the other stuff too.
So the book is Diabolical, How Pope Francis Has Betrayed Clerical Abuse Victims Like Me and Why He Has to Go. Those of your listeners who know about Milo know that the great slander used against him was that he apologized for this abuse, rather than that he was a victim of the fact that he had been abused by one of his priests, or not his priest, a priest, who he explains in the book he met through a fellow member of the choir that he was practicing with when he was a teenager.
Okay, so this is something I didn't know. So he was an abuse victim.
He was an abuse victim, and a year and a half ago, when he was shamed on the national media, he talked about that in the press conference that he gave in February 2017, saying, I made jokes about it, but now I appreciate that, not everybody is able to live beyond that abuse without being more affected by it than maybe I was. And that what's interesting to me is, of course, and I say this, I say this in the foreword, maybe I should say it in my own words from the foreword, okay. This is interesting to me is, of course, and I say this, I say this in the foreword, maybe I should say it in my own words from the foreword, okay, this is from the book. Milo was wrongly accused by the world's media in February 2017 of being, quote, soft on pedophilia, because he'd spoken loosely about his own experiences with an abusive priest and told a few off-color jokes. I had never seen such a cruel attempt at a public execution on the basis of nothing. It shocked me. I realized what the world was prepared to do to smother unsayable truths, and how dangerous the power of laughter is to despots. And it's in fact the thing that Milo likes talking about least. I mean, he'll make jokes about absolutely everything, but the problem, the experience that he had, and it's part of his story also, growing up gay, right? Which I think has been incredibly difficult for people to be willing to talk about, that men have these sorts of experiences, maybe not with their priests, but with older men when they're teenagers. And it's something that, nobody seems willing to look at. The LGBT lobby tends to try to shame Milo for even talking about it. And conservatives and many Catholics say, well, he can't possibly be Catholic if he still, lives that lifestyle. He doesn't in ways that he had been previously. I mean, he's married in the sense that he's promised to live with one person right now and loves him very much. Now I've forgotten what the question is. This is hard for me to.
Yeah, no. So a lot of this is very
true. Oh, so he needed to, so when the scandal broke again this summer, it was like, he needed to, it was in some way he needed to say something because he's the most prominent victim right now. And he needed to speak up because of all of the victims that there have been. I mean, if you've heard about Milo, you've probably heard about this part of his story. But of course, what he is Catholic, and he doesn't want the church to be burned to the ground. Mm-hmm. He wants the church to be reformed and restored. And in the book, he makes the argument that, the church, the priesthood has itself betrayed the church by its willingness to sort of don't ask, don't tell with respect to the gay lobby in the church, the lavender mafia. And that, that I say in my foreword, it's what I've learned, what I've recognized, and comes from my own studies in the Middle Ages about the ideal of clerical celibacy. The priest should be celibate, right? Wink, wink, nudge, nudge, and not saying anything about their homosexual practices, as opposed to expecting them not to be married, is sinful and dangerous. Showing that it's not just priests that have abused children, but it's people like McCarrick abusing men in the seminaries. And so they're not necessarily children, but they're young men who are then caught up in this network of what I would call simony, because it's the medieval understanding of it, that it's influence peddling, right? Mm-hmm. It's the world again, right? The great temptation is always, bow down to Satan and he will give you the world. And the church is no more, no less. I don't know whether it's
probably more. A special target for it.
It's a special, I'd say it's a special target because evil is always going to go for the thing that's most good. Mm-hmm. And that the church has been corrupted. Yes. I mean, I've been talking about the demons as both thoughts and beings. The reality of evil is something that we have a difficulty talking about in modern culture, but it is real. And clearly the Satan talking about in modern culture, but it is real. And clearly the Satan targets the most beautiful thing in creation, and that's the church.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. First off, I love your forwardness, because I'm like a full-on hardcore supernaturalist, if that's an appropriate term. Good. And I think it's so important. The things like spiritual warfare need to be discussed and talked about, because they're real. They're actually there, and they're going on in the church. And if it's like another irony is I actually had a 3-hour training. I'm a Sunday school teacher now on child abuse and all this stuff just today. I literally had that this morning. And one of the major and like very important. But the one thing that I kind of raised this objection I was, a little concerned about is like, okay, maybe this is just because, we're dealing with children directly. But if there's one thing that came out of the Pennsylvania grand jury report that was shocking to me, was that 84% of the cases were not. Why isn't this being talked about? This is a huge problem. I mean, statistically, if nothing else. Not that the other thing isn't a huge problem, that is. But why didn't we know about this?
Statistically, it's the young men that it's a much bigger problem. And Milo talks about all of that, and he shows how it's not just a sexual abuse scandal. It's also a simony, in the sense of one of the reasons that the cover-ups happen is because the people involved wielded money. Right. Mm-hmm. They had access to funds. They had access to people in influential positions. And I mean, that's my great hero in all of this. I wrote about him in my first book, is the Cardinal Peter Damian, who wrote back in the 11th century in the first great reform of the church, about how all sins get bound up with each other. Right. It's not just you have a sexual sin and a sin of corruption through paying for offices, which is what simony is. Corruptions of, failure to perform, bound up with each other, right? It's not just you have a sexual sin and a sin of corruption through paying for offices, which is what simony is. Corruptions of, failure to perform your offices, priests being married is a problem, because they're spiritual fathers to their parishioners, and being a father to an actual family, it's divided loyalties, right? And also what I say in my foreword is, it's like becoming a priest should be something hard. And I think, curiously, of all of the things that we've done in modern life, is sort of think that everything should be made easier, right? It's like, oh no, we don't want to make, put people through trauma because, they might be challenged. Well, you and I have been talking about this. It's like, you want challenge as a martial artist or an athlete. You want challenge as an intellectual in the schoolroom. Being a priest should be a challenge, because it's a great responsibility for your entire parish. Seriously, again, as it's a manly calling, and it should be a manly and rigorous and difficult calling, because it's that valuable.
Yeah, I can certainly, I'm going to be the last person to disagree with that. And this stuff is hard to talk about, especially since I know a lot of people listening to this, probably aren't Catholic. And the last thing I want to talk about to people who aren't Catholic is all the muck and mire and just disgustingness that's in the church. But like you, I'm sure I love the church. I love it. Not the corruption, all this stuff, but what the church really is the bride of Christ. And And, you don't abandon Jesus for the sins of Judas, right? I think is how the saying goes. So to me, I don't like talking about it, but it's one of those things that needs to be talked about, because when you love something, you want to care for it. You want to help it. You want to fix it. So,
well, and to go with our model, it's, Mary will say what
for it. You want to help it. You want to fix it. So,
well, and to go with our model, it's, Mary will say Western civilization. Mary, I think what's happened is modernity lost Mary, right? And that we diminished and belittled her so that she's image of woman, and the feminine, which is a not because women are not important and valuable, but because it is only she's mother of God, right? And that creature who gives birth to the creator is a larger mystery than just the gendered element of her character, right? She is in fact a model for all souls. And her virtue, her response to God should be the soul's response to God, which is, obviously utter obedience. But the conversation between Gabriel and Mary in Luke is just fascinating, because of grace. The virgin's name was Mary. The angel comes into her and he says, "Hail, full of grace, the Lord is with you," which says, in the medieval exegesis, it's as if he's already there, right? So at what moment does she become pregnant is a sort of mystery. And, you're going to become mother of the most, your child will be called son of the Most High. And she says, how can this be? So, question, right? She wants knowledge. She wants to understand. And Gabriel explains to her. And then she says, let it be unto me according to your word, which in the 12th century was taken as the great moment of her consent. To come back to what I said about when I was reading Bernard of Clairvaux as an undergraduate, he has this wonderful meditation. It's like the whole world lies prostrate at your feet, waiting for your consent. Until Mary says yes, salvation hangs in the balance. So her free will is utter at that moment. And it's very important for our salvation that God does not rape her.
Yeah,
very important for our salvation that God does not rape her.
Yeah, I heard that. So let me just pause right there. I heard that when I first started getting into Christianity, I went to, I won't even mention the denomination because I don't think it was particularly tied to that denomination, just this one particular meeting we went to. And that was presented, and a lot of other things were denied. And I was still figuring things out. And at that point, I'm like, look, as a Christian, I don't know everything I'm supposed to believe yet, but I'm fairly certain I'm not supposed to believe that.
Right. Well, and that comes out of 1980s feminist theology. And my other reason for loving Milo is, feminism is cancer, particularly what it's done to theology. Right. And there were feminist theologians in the 1980s, most prominent among them, Mary Daly, who specifically argued that Mary was raped by God. Right. It's like, the great God the Father rapist, that in consent is necessary to the incarnation, that he did not want to take flesh from her unwilling, which that comes from the first Song of Songs commentary that I said I read, that William of Newborough has this meditation on her consent is absolutely necessary for salvation. So she says yes to God and then declares himself her servant, and his servant declared, behold the handmaid of the Lord, right? And that this relationship of service is fascinating, right? That it's not submission. It's willing service, right? And that in the iconography, there's a lot of head bowing, right? And so in the late medieval iconography, Gabriel often kneels when he comes into Mary. But then when she is assumed into heaven in body, as the mystery has it, and is seated with Christ on the throne with him in heaven, she bows. But then when she is assumed into heaven in body, as the mystery has it, and is seated with Christ on the throne with him in heaven, she bows to him, right? And he crowns her. And that there's this wonderful mutual service and elevation, right? That God kneels to her in the messenger, in Gabriel, and waits for her consent. And then she kneels to him and serves him as his mother. It's a wonderful mutuality of this sort of sense of Dante describes her as having the face most like Christ's. She's the most perfect reflection of God.
Mm.
And that twinning of imagery is very, very important. I'm trying to answer a question you asked me.
I was so taken in by all that if there was a question.
I know there was still, what's the answer? How do we save all of this?
Yeah, but trying to trace
where virtue comes from. You were asking me about, so where virtue comes from. Well, I think now I'm getting to it. This is my next big project.
Mm-hmm.
Why I'm reading about the virtues and vices. I'm saying Mary is the seed, the model for virtue, right? And you recognize that it's in relation to God. Virtue is a relationship with God, and that you train yourself in that. I mean, this is the way medieval Christians talk about it. They're modeling themselves on Mary because she models the proper relationship with God. And that is clearly what we need to learn.
That's beautiful. We look at that. We somehow tied it all back in. This has been absolutely fascinating and fantastic. I can't thank you enough for taking the time. So if we can, let's just let's wrap up with this. Where are the best places for people to get your book? Maybe give people some starting resources, and the best place to get your book. Maybe give people some starting resources, and the best place to get them, and then to keep up with you and all the many things you're doing through social media and all that.
Okay. So I have a homepage, an academic homepage, which is Rachel Fulton Brown. It's on home.uchicago.edu/Tilda Fulton. But if you Google me, you'll find that. And I have listed there all my academic publications and links to my books on Amazon. Mary and the Art of Prayer, The Hours of the Virgin in Medieval Christian Life and Thought is the book that I was talking about. The training from the C.S. Lewis meditation is the opening for that book. And you can buy that on Amazon. There's also a link on my page to buy it through Columbia University Press. For my blog, there are links on my homepage to everything else too. My blog is fencingbearatprayer.blogspot.com. And there you'll find all my writing, and my other adventures in academia are on the page called Medieval Gate. We happily did not talk about that today. No, please, no more on that. I want to talk about Mary and virtue.
I love it. Yeah, no, I'm glad we did.
And I have a link on the blog called Bear on Air, another page where I have more videos of mine posted. But my folks want me to tell you about Three Craters Symposium, which is a conversation we have each week about stuff, right? Culture and politics. And we had a special guest. Milo came once when we were having a toga party, and he showed up as Poseidon.
Oh, well, fun! How fun!
Yes, and you can see my picture of me with him in that moment on my Facebook page. Please visit me on either my page, Rachel Fulton Brown, or if you want to play in the conversation, my profile is Rachel Brown.
Yeah, so that's a lot of different stuff. I'll make it easy for everybody and make sure
Thank you for having me.
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfood. Good day.